Tonight, we talk about immigration. Immigration is a topic, obviously, we don't have to say it here in Arizona, but it's a topic that is in the top 3 when you talk about politics, when you talk about policy. And we wanted to touch this not only because it's relevant always, but because it's going to be relevant this year and especially next year. There's people, institutions, campaigns that are going to try to move policy forward. And it's important for all of us to see what is being proposed, to know what is actually in the bills, and to know what the impact of that will be. So tonight, we've gathered 3 different experts, actually 4 different experts, because I would consider the moderator very well-versed on this topic, on the issue of immigration in Arizona. We're going to view it through the lens of the U.S., but also on how it's affecting us here in the state. Every single citizen, every single vote that is going to count next year is going to have to go through this conversation.
Hi guys, thank you so much for being here. It's such a great time to talk about this. A topic that we all know it's so important, and the reality is we need to continue having these conversations until action is taken, and as of now nothing is happening, so I'm really glad that Arizona Talks is doing this. My name is Valeria Aponte. I'm Telemundo Arizona's political reporter. I've been covering immigration I think almost 10 years now. It started off covering the humanitarian crisis under President Obama. I started off in Texas in the Rio Grande Valley. I then transferred to Washington, D.C., where I learned more about the policy. And then I came here to Arizona, where we face everything locally, nationally, and even in the border. What about you, José? Tell us a little bit about what you do and your connection to this topic.
Thank you for having me. José Patiño, originally from Guanajuato, Mexico. I came to the U.S. when I was 6 years old. Grew up in West Phoenix. Now I'm a DACA recipient. I work with Aliento. I'm the Director of Education and External Affairs. Basically, I do a lot of our trainings and workshops with educators, counselors, on how to support undocumented and mixed immigration status students, and do some of our policy advocacy at the state capitol as well as the federal level. So I do a lot of things and then try to figure out where I'm needed, so fill in the gaps. And I'm excited to be here.
Hi, my name is Angela Banks, and I am a professor at the ASU Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, and I write and teach about topics related to immigration and membership and belonging in democratic societies.
Hey everybody, I'm Adam Estle. I'm the Vice President of Field and Constituencies at the National Immigration Forum. I grew up in Peoria, where I still live, and it's my role with the National Immigration Forum to lead all of our different efforts around the country, encouraging a better conversation on immigration. We focus our conversation on folks kind of in the middle, so we take arrows from both sides, and looking forward to this conversation. A lot of our work focuses on sort of what we call grass tops leaders, so especially those in evangelical faith communities, law enforcement, national security, maybe a little bit of a unique angle to talking about immigration and the value that immigrants bring to all of our communities. So I'm also really happy to be here.
Thank you guys so much. So vamos al grano, let's go straight to the point. And my first question is, there hasn't been a comprehensive immigration legislation passed by Congress and signed by the president with a pathway to citizenship since President Reagan. I'm going to start with you, Adam. Why do you think is that?
Oh my goodness. Jumping right into it.
That's how I am.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is a difficult thing for Congress to do. I think immigration, first of all, immigration is a federal issue, so I know we're going to talk later about some things that might be happening at the state level that can either make things more or less comfortable for immigrants in our communities, more or less able to participate in states and communities across the country. But ultimately, the topic of immigration has been designated as something that the federal government has to handle. And when we talk about immigration reform, it raises a lot of flags for people on both sides of the issue. It's a very emotional topic for people and a very difficult topic for Congress to wrap its head around. We've come close a few times. When I started doing this work back in 2013, I think is the closest we've been in a while, when a comprehensive immigration reform bill got 68 votes in the United States Senate and never received a vote in the House of Representatives. And Jose and I have talked about this. We both agree that it would have passed the House if we had gotten it to a vote. But there are always some political dynamics in which, it seems like in certain ways, both parties to a certain extent benefit from continuing to use immigration as a political issue. And so we continue to kick the can down the road and continue to kick the can down the road. And meanwhile, the problem only gets worse. And we see situations like the crises at the border, which we could actually handle with immigration reform. And to say nothing about all of the opportunities that are lost from all of the undocumented folks in our communities who aren't able to fully participate in our society. So I think it's a lot about the politics of the issue that prevent us from actually getting something done.
So I would just add it's absolutely about the politics. And one of the reasons it becomes so difficult is because despite the fact that there is widespread public support for something like a DREAM Act or some sort of pathway to citizenship, it always gets tied to something else. And so we're not going to, be able to move a DREAM Act forward unless we also deal with border control. And then what happens is the issues that get pushed for, like, we're not going to budge on these aspects of border control are just unacceptable to the other side, and so we just end up in this log jam. And so it's really interesting the extent to which a lot of immigrant rights advocates have said, maybe comprehensive immigration reform isn't the best way to think about legal reform moving forward, that it's just too hard because of how all of these issues get coupled together, and maybe it's important to decouple them so that we can at least provide some advancement on some specific areas in immigration law.
Yeah, immigration is always going to be difficult. Immigration changes the culture of the country. You look back 10, 20 years ago, the demographics have shifted, right, since 1965. It will continue to shift. And there's this fear from the native population that the world is changing, that the way they grew up is no longer true. And I think that fuels some of the uncertainty. I think additionally, the parties and politics have shifted. And so in 1986, the people who support immigration reform were the business community and faith leaders. And people who are against immigration reform were the unions and the Latino leaders. So we see that shifted throughout the years. Now we're a lot of faith communities, specifically, I was raised Catholic, so a lot of the Catholic community is quiet. I was there in 2018 for several months, and I knocked on every single Senate office and met with every single senator except Schumer and McConnell, almost every single House member, and you did not see the Catholics there. You saw other faiths, and the majority of the immigrant population are Catholics. And if you don't have the moral faith to ground us and push away from the politics, you're not going to be able to cut through everything that exists. And then additionally, I think that there's people who benefit. Both Democrats, progressives, conservatives, libertarians benefit from having people undocumented. My majority of oppression when I was undocumented wasn't by white folks. It was another brown people who were citizens who would say to me, I don't want you to become a citizen because I don't want to compete with you. And that still happens all the time. So it's immigration is difficult because if you think about it, why would somebody migrate? And what is the journey that they make? Like I don't know if I'll talk about my dad. My dad, when he crossed to the U.S., it took him 6 days and 6 nights to cross to the Sonoran Desert. And by the 6th day, they ran out of water. And they went to the side of the road because they were like, we got to get CBP to get us. Ultimately, somebody from the reservation, Tohoram Oram reservation, came by and gave them water and then took them to their place, and they were able to come to the U.S. Like, there's these people who are willing to risk their life to come into the country to work. Like, all they want is to work so they can provide food on the table for their kids, a roof over their heads. So these people are going to be hungry to work and to provide, and they're not going to give up. There's this fear from the native population that I don't want to compete with them. And if we think about ourselves, how many of us have moved jobs for a better position? How many of us have moved across the state for a different position? How many of us, when somebody comes in who's new, whose energy, we are afraid or worry a little bit about them coming and taking our job or taking our positions? It's the same thing. We just look at it at other scale because these people are not from this country and they have no documentation to be able to fight a fair fight, in my point of view.
I remember, I think it was the first year of me working in this industry, I remember a Border Patrol agent saying with a passion, they're taking away our jobs. They're taking away our jobs. And I'll never forget one of my friends basically just saying, oh no, that's not true, and schooling him of how wrong he was. And she said a lot of what you just said. And you all brought up something that we hear over and over and over again when it comes to immigration. It's difficult. It's difficult to pass. It's difficult to convince the other side. Or it's not a priority for whoever's in power, even though they use it as a talking point when they want to get elected. Then shouldn't we change the message of it's difficult to, it makes sense. It's gonna benefit the United States, because we've talked about the human side, and we're gonna touch base on that later. But we don't hear a lot about the economic benefits that it's going to bring to the United States. I mean, if they already benefit the economy by being undocumented, imagine if they're citizens. We're talking about a huge growth on the GDP. Even right now, we know there are so many vacant jobs, and with the bipartisan infrastructure bill that passed and that it's going to be signed on Monday, that creates even more jobs. You see in the streets everywhere, we're hiring, we're hiring. You have the huge banner saying how much they're paying more than the minimum wage in Arizona. So doesn't it make sense right now, Jose, I'll start with you, I'll go backwards, for the economy, for a pathway to citizenship?
It always makes sense. We know that even if you look at data, right, typically the first generation that come as adults is a net zero in terms of positive or negative. Where you see the greatest attribute is their children or people who come like myself as children, because you get to understand the systems, get educated, and then you become more contributive. And then if you know that also that immigrants tend to be higher business owners, higher entrepreneurs, because we're more willing to take risks. We already came to a new country. We already came with nothing. It doesn't affect us if we start something new from scratch. So there's the entrepreneur spirit. And as you mentioned, we're talking about billions, trillions of dollars if we look at federally and also here nationally. But again, I go to the fundamental question is that some people are going to be losers if you legalize immigration. Like if you give a pathway to citizenship to all the 11 million undocumented people, there's people who might lose their jobs. We have to be honest about that, because you think of the construction sector, you think of agriculture, you think of food and industry. There's going to be people who are going to come in and be able to take those jobs. And there's some people, we don't have a system to be able to reallocate those people, educate them to transfer them to other sectors. We see what's happening with the coal industry, with other parts of the economy. But overall, it's going to be a net positive. But there is going to be some populations who are going to be negatively affected, and we cannot ignore that. So then it's on the government and as a society, how do we support those people because they're part of our country?
But the benefits are more.
Well, and I would say I would even think about it in terms of who is going to benefit and who do we place the blame on this idea of they're taking our jobs? Because nobody ever talks about an illegal employer. Yeah. Nobody uses the language to demonize the employers who are trying to maximize their profits by paying as little as they possibly can for labor. And we somehow shift that conversation to one about the people who are taking jobs who are not being treated well in those jobs, poor working conditions, wage theft, low wages, etc. And so I have a new book that just came out, and one of the chapters talks about the immigrant labor paradox, which is this country seems to have made a deal, which is, on the one hand, we are going to allow the employers to have access to the low-wage workers that they desire, but because there is so much public concern about that population and viewing them as a threat, we will not provide a sort of lawful pathway for them to come to the United States and take these jobs. And so we end up with this tension where the employers get the workers that they want, but they're in this country in a status that doesn't allow them to become full members of our political community via legal status or citizenship. And I think that's a real tension that exists in our system, and we're not willing to sort of rethink our economic model to think about the fact, are we really a country that is okay with our economic growth being dependent at this moment on low-wage workers? And this has been a part of American history since the beginning of time. I mean, you think about the economic development of this country, it has been built on the backs of enslaved people in the American South. In the Southwest, it has been people from different parts of Central America and Mexico. The Chinese built the railroads. I mean, this is just a part of the story of America. And until we really come to terms with that, I don't think we're going to be able to recognize the broader economic benefit that we will receive if everybody has status and everybody has an opportunity to participate fully.
Yeah, amen. I mean, I think that we have to recognize that dark side of our immigrant history, but also what Jose was saying is, absolutely true as well. I mean, part of the reason why this country has risen to the top of nations around the world economically and in many other ways is because of the innovation that immigrants bring and have always brought to this country. So we forget that. We are laser focused on the present and forget the past. Often we forget our own family's immigrants' history. And so we lose track of those realities. I think also the economic arguments are so clear in this issue of the benefits of immigrants and the lawful status would bring to our communities.
And I'm glad you brought it up because when you interview or when you meet these people, the story's the same in which they just want to come here and work. They want to give their children the life they can't give in their countries. Because sometimes it's not escaping the violence of gangs only. It's escaping violence in their own families. Like, it's a situation of life or death. Over and over again, you hear these stories, and it's not even adults. It's children escaping this violence. And we're seeing another crisis at the border, which is not talked aloud, but if you looked at the numbers of CBP, we're seeing historic numbers for months now. But the numbers always go up every time a new administration comes. And wouldn't it make more sense? I'm going to start with you, Angela, because these people pay thousands of dollars for a trafficker to get them here. If there was immigration reform, if the visa system would change, that could be money that could be coming to the United States because they want to come here the legal way. But it's so hard for them to get here the legal way.
Well, and I think one of the things you're raising is not only just the legal access into the United States, but safe passage. I mean, this is one of we often talk about these migration crises and whatnot, and I think some of that, the way it gets framed is problematic because it suggests that there is this, sort of massive threat out there that is encroaching on our borders, and if we don't act quickly and, raise the defenses, we're going to be overrun in ways that they talked about, the threats that people perceive. Whereas, a lot of migration is cyclical. It's seasonal. Like, it is not that unpredictable. As you mentioned, when there's a new administration. So oftentimes this idea that CBP is just caught off guard about the numbers just doesn't really reflect the reality if there was proper planning and thought put into this. And then that piece about, if we had pathways for people to have safe passage, we wouldn't have the situation of unaccompanied children arriving at our borders, in large numbers, because there would be a sort of structured way because they had a visa, because they had a way to, be able with that visa to get a plane ticket or get a train, and be able to enter into the United States. So I think all of these things are relevant in terms of thinking about the quote unquote crisis at the border.
Well, and I think we have to talk about not only what should we do with people who want to stay here permanently and live their life here and have a pathway to citizenship, but a big part of this conversation has to be also who are the workers that want to be here temporarily. So part of what we've done over the last 20 years with the over-militarization of the border is not only have we built up our defenses to keep people out, but we've actually kept people in who traditionally have done seasonal work in the United States, who've wanted to maintain their families back in their home country, come to work in the United States, give the labor that we need that American citizens aren't doing, picking apples in Washington, for example, and then going back home to their home country. But we've now created a system where those people are actually trapped inside the country, and they know that if they leave, the chances of them ever being able to come back are slim to none. So the overhaul that has to happen has to talk about the temporary visas that we need. It has to be a flexible system. We could create a flexible system that says, okay, every year the number of visas that are going to be allocated to each category is going to correspond with how our economy is and what our needs are. And then the next year we're going to have X number of visas, and it may be higher than the previous year or it may be lower. And we can do that if there's the political will to do so.
And you meet people along the way where they send them back. We saw it during Obama. We've seen it during Trump. We're seeing it now. But they come back. We've met people that come back because it's just safer for them to do that passage again than to stay in their country.
Yeah, as you said, walls for both things, right? Keep in, keep out. In terms of the cost, it's a family member who had recently migrated. He paid $10,000 to get to the U.S., right? And the way it works, you have to pay from where you're migrating up north. So you got to pay somebody the military, that makes the military, because if not, they're going to take advantage of you. So you pay safe passage there. And then you pay the cartels because the cartels control the pathways. So you pay the cartels so you can cross from Mexico to the U.S. And then once you're in the U.S., you pay to be transported into a safe house in any part of the country. Specifically, people are going more to Texas. And then you pay to be transported from there to your final destination. So most of them don't have those $10,000. So what they do is they sell their labor. I'm going to work for you for 3, 4, 5 months. And then afterwards, I pay my debt, and then I'm free to go. And that's how they do it. So you're basically talking some form of indentured servitude that we're having because of this immigration crisis. And the question is, are we okay with this? And that's people who make it, right? What happens if you don't make it? What happens if you get caught? You have to pay it again. And now you're not indebted $10,000, you're indebted $20,000. So now your labor is tied to this individual who paid for you for longer. And that is what this system is going to cost. And no matter how hard it is to cross, people are going to cross. There is this hope for them, for themselves and for the family. They're going to try to do better. We got to ask ourselves, what would we do? What would we do if we didn't have the opportunity, if we didn't have food, if we were hungry, if our children were asking, hey, I don't have food, I'm hungry, what am I going to eat? If we're cold, if we're hot, what are we going to do? We will probably do the same thing. So it's just that some of us have lucky enough to be born in a time, in a place where we don't have to make those decisions.
And I would just to build on that, I think the number one source of income for the cartels in all of this conversation is the broken immigration system and the lack of clarity that people have in these countries of whether or not they can come to the United States. So to speak about our asylum system, the backlogs of asylum create this environment where smugglers can say, it's okay, I'll take you, and then the worst case scenario is you can stay in the United States for a few years until you get your asylum case heard in court. If we had a clear system where people around the world knew this is how I could come and this is how I couldn't come, then people wouldn't put their lives at risk with those cartel members and smugglers with the chance that maybe it could happen. So the broken system is a boon for the cartels.
I think it's important to mention that because many times it doesn't matter what party you're in, you're still a human being. And it's important, like we say in Spanish, pónganse en los zapatos de la otra persona. Put yourself in their shoes. Why would someone risk their lives because they know it's risking their lives? It's not just easy buying a plane ticket and coming here, like many of us have the privilege of doing. It's literally risking their lives to come here. And it's what you say, a lot of times there isn't clarity. And we try a lot to explain the why. Why are they coming? What is different from their countries than here? Violence. Well, it's not only violence, it's the lack of opportunities. Here in the United States, we're privileged enough that if you're born in a low-income family and you work hard, you can change completely and become rich one day. In those countries, it's so hard. If you're born poor, you usually stay there. It's not that they stay in the society that they were born in la clase que nacieron. How do you say that?
See, in the class.
In the class you were born in.
Yeah, well, I can only speak for Mexico, right, where I was born. Se llama tienes palanca. Basically, do you have a connection? Because if not, I'm not going to get there. Like, you can have a degree, a master in advanced degree, and you're not going to be able to get that job because you don't have that connection. Here in the U.S., it's not as equitable as past generations. However, it's a lot more equitable than other parts of the world, sorry. And I know that a lot of my contemporaries are like, well, yeah, it's difficult, and we have economic inequality, and the baby boomers not retiring, and all this mess is going to... It's true, but it's so much better than other places. And a lot of people are willing to risk their lives to put themselves in your shoes.
I was just going to say there's a great poem. I think the poet's name is Warsan Shire, and she says, nobody puts their children in the water unless it's safer than the land. And so this idea that I don't think people fully appreciate is that, of course, people recognize the dangerousness of the journey and the precariousness of living in this country without legal status, but that it's still better. So what does that tell us? If that is still better, then that is really meaningful. And I really do think it's important for people to think what you were saying earlier. What would you do? Of course, we all know. Everybody in this country, we talk about, you do anything for your children. You do anything for your children, and yet we can't imagine why people would do this for their children.
I think sometimes it's just looking at the picture, at the bigger picture. Sometimes we focus only on ourselves and don't see what the struggles that others are going through. I want to go to the crisis at the border because we talked about the influx and the illegal crossings, because that's the most that you hear in the news when they cover it, because the reality is it also comes in seasons when we decide to cover it. But the crisis is much bigger than just the influx. It's the danger that these migrants are dealing with right now with programs like Title 42, the MPP program, Remain in Mexico program. We talked about this because I remember it's so funny. Jose kind of, I don't want to say warned, but he was like, when Biden got in, he was like, the influx is coming, Valeria, it's coming. But it's not about the influx, it's about the programs that are affecting these people. Talk to me a little bit about this, because we talked before the panel about this, and this is not talked a lot, about the dangers they are facing right now in Mexico.
Well, I wish my Mexican government would be more responsive to asylum seekers, Central Americans. They're not. Oftentimes, they don't provide the protection that they're asking for us here in the U.S., which is ultimately frustrating. But you have a lot of specifically in the border towns where a lot of the cartels control that, and a lot of the gangs where they take advantage of those asylum seekers because they have less protections, and some of them are trafficked for other things. Some of them are exploited. So there's the difficulty, and then part of the thing within the Biden administration is that when Trump implemented them, Title 42, right, which is that due to a global pandemic, you cannot enter the country even though you're seeking asylum. People on the left and progressives declare that as this is similar to what other parts of the world, specifically 1940s, that was done to immigrants. But most people are quiet now. And we see that happens, that people on the left tend to be quiet or a little bit less concerned when it's a Democratic president. The same thing happens on the right? They're less quiet and they don't talk about as much. They justified Trump when that was going on, and now people are justifying Biden when it's not justifiable. It's people seeking asylum. That is fair. If we create the systems to be processed, we wouldn't have all these hundreds of thousands of people at the border. We wouldn't have what happened with the Haitians. That's just despicable that it happened under a Biden administration, and that they were hiding behind, we don't have the control. You have the control. It is your administration. You just have not prioritized it, allocated funding for it.
And I think this is another example of the complicated way that politics plays out, because one of the things I think that is, frustrating is probably not strong enough of a word, but one of the things that I have been noting and thinking about, especially when we saw the images of the Haitian refugees being the way they were being treated at the border, and this is a Democratic administration, how is this happening now? You realize that within the Biden administration, there are varying opinions about how to handle immigration. Unfortunately, it is not sort of a single position where we know this is where the Biden administration stands. And so when you have internal disagreement about whether Title 42 should exist, are we kind of not, is it maybe okay that the courts have now told us that we have to continue with the Migration Protection Protocol program? And just as a background, this is a program whereby individuals who cross the Mexican border into the United States seeking asylum were not allowed to remain in the United States while their asylum case was adjudicated. They actually had to return to Mexico, and the U.S. entered into an agreement with Mexico where Mexico would allow the individuals to return to Mexico. And it's a mess in terms of access to counsel, because essentially people have to show up at the port of entry on the day of their hearings, be transported to the immigration court. This is pre-COVID. COVID, and then be transported back to the port of entry to go back into Mexico to wait for their next hearing. And then with Title 42, it's just like, nope. Then they suspended all the MPP hearings that were happening in tents along the border. And so it's a mess. And unfortunately, the Biden administration doesn't have a...
And sorry to interrupt to Adam. I want you to talk a little bit about that because they also put Title 42 under the radar because of the pandemic. And a lot of people did not find out that this was going on until months after.
Yeah. And so what's interesting, so Title 42 is a provision that allows the basically CDC to declare that the borders can essentially be closed because of a public health crisis. And so during the Trump administration, the CDC issued that ruling, and then said that the southern border is going to be closed because of concerns about COVID. The Biden administration has continued to keep the border closed. The one exception has been unaccompanied children. They are allowed to enter to seek asylum. But what's interesting is that our international borders and other ports of entry are not closed. JFK is wide open. LAX is wide open. So it's interesting that on the one hand, we have concerns about COVID along the southern border for asylum seekers and other people seeking entry into the United States, but we don't have closed borders because of Title 42. So I think that gives us some insight into what the actual concerns are.
I actually will take a different perspective on what's happening at the border. I was actually there a few weeks ago with some members from my team in El Paso and Juarez. And one of the stories that's being undertold about what's happening at the border is the way that communities on both sides of the border are responding in incredible ways to care for these migrants. We had the chance to visit a church in Ciudad Juarez that had next to nothing, but what they had, they were giving to provide for the asylum seekers that were stuck in their communities. And I'll say another thing about what kind of exacerbates this crisis on the Mexican side of the border is not only do you have the migrants who are trying to come north, is you have the deportees who have been sent south. And there's this kind of mix of hopefulness of the people who are trying to go north and despair for the people who've just been kicked south, and it creates a really difficult environment. But I would say that for all of the problems of the Mexican federal government, one bright light from my perspective is the government of the state of Chihuahua, who is putting a lot of resources toward caring for the migrants that are stuck on the Mexican side in the state of Chihuahua, right across from northwest Texas. And churches on the U.S. side are trying to welcome asylum seekers and help them get to their destination of where their court hearing is going to be. So there's a lot of things that are happening that are really difficult, but there's a lot of beautiful ways that communities are responding to try to welcome their neighbors. And I have a soft spot in my heart for El Paso. The beautiful people there who don't see this as a crisis, they see it as an opportunity to welcome people and to care for them.
And talk to us a little bit about that, because you're right, those are many of the stories that are not talked about much, and we hear of all these pastors or leaders at the other side of the border. We talk a lot to one in San Luis Rio Colorado who has been in this since the Trump administration crisis, and for days, sometimes weeks, these migrants live there, people who were removed by Title 42 or deported. I remember interviewing one that tried 4 times and every time got removed under Title 42. And now, because of one of these communities, he's building a life in Mexico because he's like, if the U.S. doesn't want me, I need to provide to my family in El Salvador, so I have to start working in Mexico.
I mean, that's happening. It's different in each border community. So if you talk about Tijuana, for example, there's a vibrant Haitian community there. Tijuana is more of a multicultural city of migrants to begin with. So they're a bit more open, not perfect, but a bit more open to migrants from everywhere in Tijuana. If you think about a place like Nogales, Sonora, there's less of that openness, less of that opportunity. So that's part of the complexity, is it's really different in each of these border communities how welcoming and how much opportunity there are for asylum seekers to stay long term.
And I just wanted to highlight something that you mentioned about this individual who had tried 4 times and had been, sort of rejected because of Title 42. And that's an important piece of information to keep in mind when we look at the CBP numbers, because a lot of the sort of CBP apprehensions are, again, people who have been multiple times removed under Title 42, whereas in other periods of time, they would have only probably been once because you didn't have those multiple attempts over short periods of time. So when you look at those CBP apprehension numbers, just keep that in mind.
Thank you so much for mentioning that. You're completely right. It is important when talking about these numbers that we see that it's probably people who are trying again to cross. So before we open up to questions, I want to talk about an important issue because even though federally we don't see a lot of action happening in immigration turning into a reality, locally we are seeing another story. And I wanted Jose to talk about this because since I've known you, you with the Aliento team have been fighting so hard for this to be a reality. And for the first time this year, you are just one step close from making it a reality. And it's the fact that here in Arizona, dreamers are not are not allowed for in-state tuition. This is something that the Arizona Supreme Court took away from them in 2018. Jose with his team in Aliento have been fighting fiercely for it to be a reality. It's going to be in the ballot this year to give dreamers in-state tuition. Talk to us a little bit about the fight and also what's in the ballot, because that's what we need to know before it's printed there and very confusedly explained.
Yeah, well, it's been a fight, a long time fight. Like I got involved in immigration when I was a senior in high school, when Proposition 300 passed. I was a senior in Carhaden, and the Carhaden community is a lot of undocumented immigrants. So it was known that all of us were undocumented. When you completed the application to go to enroll into ASU, you just were told, hey, just put zeros, it's gonna be okay. And I remember the day that my mom opened up. My mom always opens up my mail. She always, still this day, she does it. She's like, hey, you got a bill.
She knows that's illegal?
I'm not gonna do it to my mom. That's my mom. So she opened it up and she was super happy to show me, hey, you got accepted, you got a scholarship. And then a few months later, she opened up another letter saying that, hey, you're still accepted, but your scholarship is gone and you have to pay 3 times as much. And to this day, I remember that. I remember her crying, and she's like, "Hey, you tried. I know you wanted to, but this is not gonna happen." And I was like, "No, Mama, I'll figure it out." And I just knocked on a whole bunch of doors. Talked to all the teachers that I knew, all the counselors. They couldn't help. Sent to outside organizations. They didn't know how to help. Went to the community college, universities. They didn't know how to help. One of my friends got a phone number, and what had happened is that some foundations and wealthy individuals donated millions of dollars for us to go to school. And it was 2 years because they thought that the Dream Act was going to pass once we got a new president in 2009. That didn't happen, and it was a struggle for us to go to school. But at least I had that opportunity. A lot of my classmates didn't have that. So ever since then, I've been always asking, like, why can't this get fixed? And as you mentioned, we had in-state tuition from 2015 to 2018 for DACA recipients, not for undocumented students. And finally, after multiple attempts at the legislature, we're going to have it on the ballot. SCR 1044 passed last May 10th. So it's going to be on November 8th, 2022 ballot. We don't have a prop number. The language is still not clear. That's going to be a big challenge. We recently did a poll where, based on what we think the language is going to be, and it's going to be a close race. It's going to be a close fight. A lot of it is because people don't know. About 75% or some of the voters don't know that undocumented students don't have access to in-state tuition, or if they know, they're misinformed. So a lot of it is just doing a whole bunch of these types of events and educating people. And one of the things that I want to end with is that I asked my dad why he didn't continue his education. He only went to the first grade. And he said to me, las palabras no entran cuando tienes hambre. So it's, words can't enter your mind when you're hungry. So for me, it's like I have the opportunity to be able to have food in my belly, to be able to pursue education. My dad didn't, and other people have not. So for me, there was no way I was not going to figure it out.
That's amazing. Adam, going on that, talking about this initiative that is going to be in the ballot, how important is it, one, that more organizations, more faith leaders, and people get involved to support it, but also educate the community of what it consists in and how it could be a game changer?
Yeah, well, I'm a big supporter of Jose and Aliento, and I think one of the things that they have done so far that's been just ingenious in this conversation is the way that they framed the conversation around people who are educated in Arizona high schools should be allowed to have in-state tuition. I mean, who could argue with that? We've invested in these young people. in their public education, and now we should continue to invest. We don't want them to go to California or elsewhere to get their college education because they might leave and not come back, and we want them to stay and be leaders in our community. So I think it's just a brilliant way that you guys have framed this. I think we have to continue to tell the stories of the benefits of, you know, what young people have been able to contribute to the community and what more they would be able to do if we were able to offer in-state tuition. And, you know, this is I work for a national advocacy organization, and so, you know, some people in our space would see this kind of effort as, oh, you know, that's kind of small potatoes. But my argument is, hey, we have to start building some wins on top of each other. And if we can win something like this in a state like Arizona with the past that we have from SB 1070, et cetera, I think it could be a really important momentum changer for eventually a DREAM Act that would make this legislation unnecessary. Because if we were able to pass a DREAM Act in Congress, then we wouldn't be having this conversation about in-state tuition. So it's building blocks, and it was mentioned before, maybe we shouldn't be working for comprehensive, but getting the wins that we can so that we can build momentum toward continuing to knock down all of the other things that are standing in the way of not only immigrants in our communities reaching their fullest potential, but our country reaching its fullest potential from the benefits of these immigrants being able to fully participate in our society.
And I'll just add that I think one of the important pieces of the story is, and again, the way that this is being framed, is these young people are members of our community. And if we think about it in terms of membership and what are the sort of benefits and sort of things that we think attached to membership, individuals who have graduated from high school in Arizona, you know, people who have lived a certain percentage of their lives in Arizona should have access to Arizona's public universities. And, you know, every other state that does this, it is the idea that you are a member of our state community because of your tenure here and your connection to this state, and that we are going to recognize that in terms of your access to college. And so I think tying it to the idea of these are people who are part of our community, and this is important.
One more thing I'll say about Aliento and the great work that they do, and Jose hasn't paid me to do this. You know, part of the way that community members understand the benefit that these young undocumented people bring to our communities is when they have the courage to step forward and tell their stories. And through organizations like Aliento, giving young people the courage to do that, that is how we change the conversation. I can't tell you how many times I've had lunch with a pastor and I've asked, you know, do you have any young people or any people in your congregation that are undocumented? And they said, no, I don't think so. And I've asked, you know, when you did that trip to California or that mission trip to Mexico and that kid couldn't go, there's a good chance that's because they were undocumented, and the light bulb comes on and they think, oh my gosh, that might be why. And they start to explore, like, who is in my community? Where are those people? And when pastors and other community leaders start to speak out on behalf of immigrants, that encourages and empowers and emboldens the migrants in their community even more to come forward and say, hey, I'm part of this. I want this community to succeed, and, you know, here's how you can help me do that.
Thank you so much. So we're opening it up for questions. Does anybody have questions for the panel?
We're making Carlos exercise.
Yeah, this is how I exercise.
First of all, I just want to thank all of you for sharing your perspective and insight. I do believe that I was undocumented in this country for 28 years, and I was able to fix status 3 years ago. And being able to do that, I'll tell you a little bit of a story. I went to Ecuador, and after 20 years, saw my family, and part of the realization that I had was that potentially there's an opportunity here to move the immigration narrative to not just as a problem of the United States, but as a global problem, right? We have turned into this globalized economy, and it still seems that the US carries the biggest narrative when it comes to immigration. When I was in Ecuador has a lot of migration that comes from Venezuela, Cuba, Peru, Argentina, because we also use the dollar. And people in Ecuador were saying, oh, these Venezolanos, they come to take our jobs. They, steal this. They, rob our system. And as I'm looking at my family, I'm like, yo, you're talking about me in the U.S. Exactly the same narrative that they borrow from our country, right? So I do believe that as movement leaders of immigration reform, I want to challenge you to look at it from a global perspective, because it's not just us. It's really happening across the world. And also the U.S. has to begin to take responsibility in the aspect that we do drain resources from countries that then are left with nothing, and then those people come to this country to look for opportunity because the U.S. has interest in these countries that drains the resources and saying people are not left with any other choice but to come to look for opportunity here. So, and I also don't think it's fair to point to the top leadership like Biden or in this moment Donald Trump, but really is the two political parties who have leveraged immigration as a political leverage to gain votes. So there's a level of accountability that has to happen to both parties. There's a level of the movement to begin to look at this problem globally to gain more support. And there's also an opportunity for empowerment to the migrant community to understand their economic power that they hold to this community. I have literally tripled my worth since I became a resident alien, okay? And that's not a merit of me saying something to impress you, but to impress upon you what access to credit did to me. But I also know that systematically, the United States is saying, yeah, they look at us and say, oh, you contribute all these trillions, but I did 28 years of labor where I have no Social Security benefit. So that benefits is the federal government, 20 years with nothing. So cheap labor is part of this systematic process, which I think you all understand. So anyway, thank you so much for your insight. Just wanted to share that and hopefully challenge you folks who are doing and advocating for immigration reform to hopefully begin to advocate it from a more of a global perspective. Maybe we can gain more support because we do influence other countries heavily in the culture and our voice.
Thank you, Carlos.
I just wanted to sort of echo what you were saying in terms of thinking about not only is this a global issue, but also how the U.S. exports its ideas about immigration to the rest of the world. If you look at sort of immigration enforcement and sort of the militarization of immigration enforcement, that is something that is being sort of exported in terms of an approach that we are seeing more frequently in Europe and other places. And so just to echo your point that yes, it is not just a U.S. phenomenon, but the U.S. strategy in terms of how it frames immigration and how it responds to immigration is also being duplicated around the world.
I think another point to add to it, right now we have more refugees than we ever had in the history of the world, even during World War II. So in terms of not just undocumented immigration, legal migration, asylum seekers, people being displaced, it's a global issue. I think fundamentally, you have to look at every country, every system to take accountability for their actions, right? The U.S. imposes unequal treaties on countries like Mexico, Argentina, Ecuador. Then Mexico imposes unequal treaties on Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, in the Caribbean, right? So every country does that to one another because of leverage, and it comes from one place. It's like people at the top want to stay at the top, and they're going to push everybody down. So fundamentally, we have to change the way we see our systems and society. So this is a larger conversation that we want to continue to have. In terms of political parties, I think, Adam, you said it, is both parties benefit from having inequality. And in a conversation that I had with Senator Kyle a few years ago, I asked him, and he said, like, both parties, Democrats and Republicans, benefit from having this issue because I can agitate these conservative folks who come out to vote because of fear that they're being displaced and they're taking their jobs. And therefore, I can also agitate these brown communities because their people, their friends, their families are being attacked. So unless we change that calculation that you cannot be rewarded for inaction, it's not going to change.
All right. We got time for 2 more questions. Anybody? David? Going back to this side.
So, hey guys, thank you for taking the time, being brave, coming to the event, and sharing your ideas, your expressions, your feelings, and your experience. I actually have a question for you guys to pass on to the people that make decisions as well, right? I would love for you guys to be a conduit just for my singular story, but for a lot of people that I mentor. I'll begin the story saying that I am a senior millennial. I just turned 38 October 15th, so I am a lot older than what the standard DACA recipient is known by or seen by, right? They're kids. We're not kids anymore. We're full functioning adults now. That being said, my question to you guys is, when will I earn my place? I've been here since 1986. I'm from Guadalajara, Jalisco. Don't ask me about it. I've never been, all right? Pero hablo español because it's my roots. But my question about that is, so being a senior millennial in Arizona, I graduated in 2002. There was no DACA. There was no funds. There was no help. We were some of the first generations to experience a first generation without the legal paperwork, right? We grew up here. We don't know Mexico or wherever we come from. So I actually lost my full ride scholarship to ASU via Intel. My parents couldn't get me into my parents couldn't help me in high school. So I got myself at my first job called Yoshi's Fast Food Grill on Rural and Chandler Boulevard. And I got myself into Intel by asking the employees, how could I work there? So anyways, long story short, from that stage, I get a full ride scholarship to ASU via Intel. And then after that, they unplugged it when they found out I was undocumented. So then from there, I go do the typical jobs most Latino undocumented immigrants do. Shovel rocks, do some work on people's roof, scrape some pools. But eventually, I got savvy, and I read Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Then I started my path of entrepreneurship. Fast forward many years later, now I own a chain of retail stores. I employ over 50 people there. I also started, thank you. But that's not even enough. Then I started getting involved in the community regardless of race, color, culture, etc. And then I started getting involved in the community. I started the first Latino council for St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in the nation. I am now the president of BNI Alianza, the first Latino networking group for BNI in Arizona. And now I focus on helping our local economy. I am one of the top consultants from the Latino side. I work with the city of Phoenix, the city of Mesa. I have my own company with it. And eventually now I am impacting the local economy to not, regardless of race. I focus in the Latino community because I come from there. But the thing is, now I'm, not only did I overcome all that by being undocumented, right? I have DACA right now, by the way. So I have DACA. Now I'm empowering our local economy. I've worked with over hundreds of small businesses to make Arizona economies great again, or even better, right? So at what point do I become enough? That's my question.
Thank you, David.
The short answer, you don't. You can be a successful entrepreneur. You can create your own business. You can create anything that you want. You can change past policies. You're not going to be enough, right? That's how our system sees it, right? Unless the current system that we have is you get married to a citizen, right, or a resident. You get an employer to sponsor you because you are considered a genius, or you are a victim of a crime by a citizen through a U visa. There is no legal pathway. And as much as you have advocated, and I had that question specifically to a lot of senators and representatives, they have no answer. Because it's not whether you're married, it's not whether you're worth, it's not whether you can contribute to this country. It's when is it enough for me? And right now it's not enough for them.
And I will say one of the things that you're highlighting is the importance of, I think, broader conversations like what we're having here today about how do we think about membership in American society? What does it mean to be a member of American society? And does our legal structure map onto normative ideas about who is a member and who ought to be a member. And I think there's a real gap there. And so to the idea that, when will you be enough? Well, sort of interpersonally, you already are. And how can we help the nation understand that there are a lot of people who are enough, but our law doesn't recognize them as such?
Yeah, you deserve to be here. I'm not sure we deserve you. So thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. We have one more question before we break, and I just want to encourage everybody to stick around. There's a lot of really nice people here, as you can tell with Carlos, David, our panelists tonight. I hope that you guys will stick around and meet some of us. We have one more question tonight.
Okay. All right, my name is Dynasty. So I wrote down this question because I don't want to forget, but I'll give you context before I want your answer, okay? So the question is, what tools or resources are necessary that you could give immigrant students in order to make it in America and help their parents be successful as well? So I just started working at a school that has a lot of immigrant students, and one of their main things is trying to figure out how to be successful, and I'm not really sure exactly what to tell them. So based upon the research that you guys have done and your knowledge on it, what is it that you would tell them if you were in my position?
Yeah, I used to be an educator. I used to teach high school math. My major bachelor was in mechanical engineering. I never worked in mechanical engineering. I worked in stucco and landscaping because I was undocumented as well when I graduated. And I have those conversations every day with students. I do a lot of presentations and I get connected. There's scholarship resources that people have that exist. There's guides, how to navigate the system. You can have mentors coming in, but fundamentally what I've seen that has impacted the most, if you have at least one adult, especially somebody that they trust and care, that is gonna be there and tell them, I believe in you, you are enough, you don't need anything else, and we're gonna get there. And having that individual believe in you will help you overcome those systems, because the resources are limited, but some of them are there, but you need to have that person to believe in you. And if you're a educator or a mentor or a business leader, some of those things, we see how transformative those experiences are. I'm sure that David has that with some of his mentors. And I have that with a lot of the students that they tell me afterwards how transformative, just having somebody believe in them. I tell that to my teachers, so I still make in contact. So they can still go in and still be like, yeah, my work that I put in 10 years ago is reaping fruit right now.
And so I want to highlight that there's really two important pieces to your question. One is the sort of individual interpersonal that Jose, I think, spoke really powerfully about what is necessary there. And I also want to talk about structurally what's important. So the book that I just published is about civic education in the age of mass migration. And it really is about thinking about how do we teach civic education and citizenship education in our K-12 schools so that we can allow students to start questioning the boundaries of citizenship and understanding about who belongs in our society and how we think about membership, because it shouldn't just be on those students to have to fight and figure it out on their own. Our system and our structures need changing so that the opportunities are there for them and they don't have to hope that they get a great mentor who's going to allow them to succeed. So I think both in the here and now, we need that individual approach, but I also want us to think structurally and institutionally about how is it that we can teach to just not just non-citizen students, but citizen students to have a broader understanding and imagination of who is a member of this society so that they have all the opportunities that their individual ability will allow them to take advantage of.
And as a former educator, thank you for working in such an important field. And I would also just say that part of what you can do also, not just for the students that you're talking about, but for the other adults in your sphere, the other people in the education system, you can share what you know, you can help other people understand, because there's a lot of ignorance about how to help young people and what's what and what you can do. And so as you learn that information, to continue to find ways to spread it to other educators. So thank you.
Wonderful. Well, help me thank everybody. Help me thank the speakers up here. They did a wonderful job. As we get into next year is going to be a big election year. It's going to be big for not only elections, but for policy. Policy is going to move forward. You're going to be hearing their names on newspapers, on reports, on studies, on ballots maybe. But just remember that this is how we have these conversations. We have them before the year starts so that we're prepped for next year to have these conversations. I want to thank each one of you for being here and accepting and wanting to be here. So, and thank you for making Arizona Talks what it is. Next, right before you leave, or before we end the show, I want to invite Megan Greenwood up here. She's the owner of the brewery that we're sitting at and the brewer for the beer that you're drinking. So I want to give her the mic and have her say thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for drinking a beer. And we are open all night, so keep drinking. I'm Megan Greenwood. I'm the owner of Greenwood Brewing. We opened last year after 2.5 years of building this space. You are sitting in a vacant parcel, which was just an infill project as of 2 years ago. We built the building. This is adaptive reuse. It was a wild success as we're all sitting here enjoying great beer. I wanted to tell a little bit about why we built this beer garden, and it is exactly for this purpose. We have our Pilsner that a lot of you are drinking. It's called Purpose, because we believe here in the power of the purposeful pint and having really great conversations over craft beer. So thanks for being here. It takes you, and it takes all of you to have that purposeful conversation. So thanks again.
Thank you, Megan. And thanks to all of you again for your time and for your dedication. You've contributed to another civil dialogue event. If we keep doing this, our culture of being different but sticking together as a country will continue. So if any of this called out to you, whether it was the immigration topic, whether it was the beer and the space, whether it was the nonprofit, we want you to come with us. Please become a member today of the Policy Circle. Please come and talk to us. We're going to be sticking around, so get another round and hang out with us tonight. Thank you again. We'll see you next time.